Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, Pinchas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the Israelites by manifesting such zeal among them on my behalf that in my jealousy I did not consume the Israelites. Therefore say, I hereby grant him my covenant, my brit of shalom. It shall be for him and for his descendants after him a covenant of perpetual priesthood, because he was zealous for his God and made atonement for the Israelites. We'll get back to that in a moment. So before I say the words that I have prepared to say, just a quick little story. And I need to preface this story. For any of you who have ever traveled to the land of Israel, the Holy Land, there is a saying, which is, if you don't like the way I drive, stay off the sidewalks. So as the story goes, there was a very well-renowned, very famous rabbi who died and went to heaven. And when he got to heaven, he noticed that everyone received rewards. And for him, the reward was a very modest house and a bicycle, which he could ride and take that bicycle anywhere he wished to go. And so every day he would wake up and enjoy his modest house, and he would ride his bicycle and live among so many people and just felt contentment and he felt peace. But then one day he noticed something curious. He noticed a man who lived in a mansion. And this man not only lived in a mansion, but he was driven everywhere in a limousine. And he was attended to by all of the angels. And the rabbi looked at this man day after day until he finally realized that that man was an Egged, an Israeli bus driver. And he thought to himself, there's something wrong here. So he went and approached the head angel and he said, I hate to be a bother. We always love to be a bother. He said, I hate to be a bother, but I noticed something unfair. And the angel said, what's the issue, Rabbi? I said, I have served God my entire life. I preached to my community. I've advocated justice. I've been there for all the life cycle events. I've been there for my people. And for this, I get a small house and a bicycle. But this bus driver, he gets a mansion and a limousine. What's up with that? To which point the angel said, well, Rabbi, to be honest, every time you preached, people slept. But every time that man drove the bus, people prayed. So it's a roundabout way of saying, if you need to get some rest, I won't be offended. And if I happen to fall asleep during my words, feel free to nudge me. So, what do I want to speak about today? Well, I want to talk about movies. And for those who know me, I'm a big fan of superhero movies. And if you haven't had the chance, I recently, well, at first I recommend it, but secondly, with my family and some friends, had the chance to see the James Gunn Superman movie starring David Cornsweet, Rachel Brosnahan, or as we like to call her, Mrs. Maisel, and Nicholas Hoult. As far as I know, this was the first Superman to be portrayed by a Jewish actor. I mention this because one of the stories that has been lost over time are the Jewish origins of Superman. Appearing in Action Comics #1 in 1938, Superman was a creation of two Jewish boys from Cleveland, writer Jerry Siegel and artist Joe Shuster. These two sons of immigrants from Eastern Europe created a hero based on the stories about the Golem of Prague, Samson, and probably most importantly, Moses. The baby who was sent away from his parents due to an imminent threat, who was raised by parents other than his own, namely Pharaoh's daughter, and ultimately became the redeemer of his people, the Israelites. Even Superman's name, Kal-El, in Hebrew means the voice of God. Superman became an instant success and helped to pave the way for a new pop culture industry that became known as the comic book. That Jews helped create the comic book industry, much like they did for Hollywood, musical theater, vaudeville, and later stand-up comedy, the deli, and even the sitcom, just to name a few. Part of it had to do with limits of professional opportunities. When it came to comic books, so many Jewish writers and artists had so few outlets open to them, so they created an industry whose impact can still be felt throughout the world to this very day. But back to Superman. Originally, Superman was not the all-powerful God that he came to represent. Initially, he fought bullies and those who used positions of power to oppress others. As one article from Ohio History notes, one of the reasons for the early success of Superman was how Jerry wrote about real issues that affected everyday people. They included a lot of things that happened in Ohio's history, such as the mine accidents in Athens, Ohio on November 5th, 1930. As time passed, they started to include stories of Superman fighting anti-Semitic people, with Hitler's rise in Europe with his anti-Semitic words and the negative stereotypes of Jewish people pushed Siegel and Shuster to make a hero that defended the weak. They often would portray Superman protecting the weak and those who were mistreated. He was a hero the world needed as World War II began in Europe. Shuster and Siegel worked hard to tell stories of hope that would cheer people on as things looked hopeless. In sort of a Freudian way, Superman represented all the qualities that Siegel and Shuster were not. He was strong, confident. Siegel in particular identified more with Clark Kent, who just wanted to use his talent to have a positive impact on the world and to stick up for the little guy. Siegel put all of his anger, hurt, frustration, his optimism, and perhaps most importantly, his righteous indignation into his Übermensch, his Superman. But more on this in a moment. But first, just a little bit about Judaism. In case you are not familiar, we have a weekly reading from the Torah called a parashah, or parshiot in plural. What happens is we start the Torah reading cycle during the festival of Simchat Torah with Bereshit, the first portion in Genesis, and then we read it 1 week at a time until we conclude with the end of Deuteronomy on Simchat Torah, where we start all over again. Torah is a never-ending cycle. It gets a little more complicated with holidays and festivals, as well as the addition of a leap month, but just know, since Torah is a scroll, we start at the beginning, go all the way through until we start over again. This past week, we read from Parashat Pinchas. But to explain Pinchas, we actually have to go to the previous week's parashah. I know, just stick with me. That parashah, Balak. What we find at the end of Balak is a deeply troubling story. It involves an Israelite man behaving in an explicit way with a Midianite woman in front of the tent of meeting. Outraged, Pinchas, often translated as Phineas for you Phineas and Ferb fans, took a spear in his hand and, for lack of a better word, in his anger, impaled the couple. In Parashat Pinchas, we are told the fate of Pinchas, whereby, as I mentioned, God spoke to Moses saying, Pinchas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the Israelites by displaying among them his passion for me, so that I did not wipe out the Israelite people in my passion. Say, therefore, I grant him my pact of friendship, of shalom. It shall be for him and his descendants, after him a pact of priesthood for all time, because he took impassioned action for his God, thus making expiation for the Israelites. We also learn the name of the couple who were killed. As the Torah mentioned, the Israelite was Zimri, son of Salu, a notable figure in the community, a chieftain of the Shimeon clan. And the woman was Cosbi, the daughter of a Midianite chieftain. Clearly two very important people. We know this in part because they were both named. Even the person who was tried as the first Sabbath violator was not named in the Torah. But more on that in a little bit. But be that as it may, Pinchas is often portrayed as the hero of the story, acting out in righteous anger to save his people from immorality. This would seem to be an apparent contradiction against one of the 13 attributes of God's forgiving nature, as is listed in the incident after the Egel Zahav, the golden calf, where God is described as, among other things, Erech Apayim, being slow to anger. And yet here with Pinchas, we find someone not slow to anger, but instead someone who was quick to act out of anger. As is noted in Eitz Chaim, the conservative Torah commentary, Pinchas killed an Israelite man and a Moabite woman because of their flagrant immorality profaned God's name. The Torah seems to approve of Pinchas's extreme act. Some modern as well as ancient commentators follow suit. Thus Hirsch, for example, anyone who wages war on the enemies of what is good and true is a champion of the covenant of peace on earth, even while engaged in war. The Chatam Sofer praises Pinchas for showing the same zeal and energy to do right that the sinning Israelites displayed in doing wrong. Thus, all would seem to indicate that what Pinchas did was right and just and should be emulated. But I should let you know, there is a law, and that is Rabbi Sharff's law of rabbinic interpretation. And that law is, for every interpretation, there is an equal and opposite interpretation. As the Eitz Chaim goes on to note, some post-biblical commentators, however, have been uncomfortable with the zealous vigilantism of Pinchas, criticizing his fanaticism as a dangerous precedent. The Talmud claims that had Pinchas asked the rabbinic court, the Sanhedrin, if it was permitted to kill Zimri and Cosby, citing halakha to justify his request, the court would have told him, the law may permit it, but we do not follow that law. What the rabbis here are doing is cautioning against religious zealotry, as violence often leads simply to more violence. Even the Torah is uncomfortable with Pinchas' actions. We know this in part because how is Pinchas rewarded? He is rewarded with the Brit Shalom, the covenant of friendship, the covenant of peace. And he is granted the inherited position of priesthood, which, if you think about it, would limit any future ability to react violently out of anger. So friends, what then are we supposed to do with the lesson of Pinchas if acting out of anger and a sense of righteousness is not necessarily the correct course of action? Thank you for asking. Thankfully, there is another lesson shortly thereafter in the parashah that gives us some insights. Just one chapter later, the daughters of Zelophehad, descendants of Joseph, approach Moses. Interestingly enough, all 5 daughters are named. Remember, more often than not, people are not named, and especially women. Machlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. We note this in part because women all too often remain unnamed in the Torah, including Lot's wife and Noah's wife, who is later named Naaman rabbinic tradition, and not what I always thought, which was Joan of Arc. Let you think about that for a moment. What is remarkable in part about Machlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah is that though later on in rabbinic commentaries where they are described as being older unmarried women, here they were most likely girls and teenagers, as they took it upon themselves to address an issue of injustice that had arisen, namely an issue of inheritance that had been overlooked. The issue was their father died in the wilderness of his own accord, and he had no sons. And these 5 daughters, because of this, would be left with no inheritance, and their father's name would die out along with him. But it is even more remarkable because the 5 sisters did not apologize or diminish themselves in requesting a change to the inheritance law. Instead, they, with chutzpah, went straight to Moses and demanded a change. They demanded tzedek, justice. And by the term chutzpah, by the way, as an aside, It doesn't just mean bravery. Here's the best example I can give of chutzpah, and it's a little distressing, but bear with me. The story involves a young man who sadly kills both of his parents. He's eventually arrested and dragged before the court, where he flops down on his knees and appeals to the judge, "Please, Your Honor, be merciful, for I am an orphan." That is chutzpah. As is noted in the WRJ Torah commentary, 5 daring sisters, Machla, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah, also known as Zelophehad's daughters, brilliantly challenged the inheritance system, which had disenfranchised them when they request to share in the land. In this episode, these sisters succeeded in securing a legacy for themselves so that they, rather than their father's male relatives, will inherit his portion. But they do even more than that. They do even more than that, something unique and extraordinary. They initiate a Torah law, a legal precedent that becomes a legacy for future generations, because what they ask for themselves becomes a law sanctioned by God. This case is important in showing women who challenge community practices and who thereby bring significant modifications to existing legislation in order to meet changing social needs. As Rabbi Pamela Wax notes in the Musar Torah commentary, these women did not play nice in the diffident ways that women stereotypically might as they made their case. Rabbi Sylvania Chemin makes a strong case that because they considers God's law to be just or to aim to be just, they show no hesitation in pointing out the unfair nature of the present situation with complete confidence. In other words, their claim was for God, for their father, and for themselves, with no inherent contradiction between personal and religious motivations. Machla, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah exemplify the politics of just protest, claiming rights for themselves and for others disenfranchised by the system. And that is an anger worthy of holiness. And in the story of the daughters, we find the fundamental difference between religious zealotry and the pursuit of justice. Holy anger is not about vengeance. No, it is about righting wrongs. It is about the pursuit of justice. It is about speaking up for the disenfranchised. It is about making history because the world is made better through these actions, these protests, these fights to right wrongs. Now back to Superman. We often associate him with the phrase truth, justice, and you've heard it. Believe it or not, this was not part of his origin story, but instead became popularized in the Adventures of Superman radio show, which began to appear in 1942. For a long time, these values have been associated with the character of Superman, but sadly, as of late, they have become diminished as the movies have attempted to reach larger international audiences. But at its core, Superman, like the daughters of Zelophehad, and like so many stories of our inherited tradition, are all about the pursuit of justice. There are so many causes we continue to fight for today that, like Superman, are actually biblical in origin. The fight for the poor, the stranger, often translated the ger, the immigrant, the widow, the disenfranchised, is not a new fight. It is one that is everlasting, and one that demands of us a continued sense of religious anger. As individuals, we do not have to take on all these fights, for there are too many. Even Superman could not save everyone. But that does not absolve us of the struggle. As we learn from the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, you are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to desist from it. So friends, what does this mean? Well, what it means is we should feel compelled to metaphorically pick up the spear and continue the fight, especially for all those who need someone to stand up for them. And we know who those people are. We do not do this out of any sense of religious zealotry, but instead because of righteous indignation. Until the world is as it ought to be, the battles for truth and justice will continue, which should not only always be the American way, but should always be the religious way as well. Kei nihi ratzon, be this God's will. Amen. Ribono shel olam, God of all, continue to look down upon us and guide us as we seek to engage in fellowship to repair the hurts, the pain, the suffering in the world. Help inspire us through your teachings to remind us that we are all human beings on this campus, in this community, in this greater world, all united together with belief in you and with hope that together we can bring about a greater sense of justice and mercy in the world. Inspire us in our actions, guide us in our deeds. Provide us with hope when sometimes all we feel is despair. And remind us that we have the capacity to do good, to lift up each other, and to bring hope, healing to the world so desperate in need of it. And help us bring about a better sense of peace, of contentment, of relationship, and holiness that the world so desperately needs. Amen.